our next presenter is Bradley Rickard. Brad is, I know Brad well, but he's a associate professor here in the Dyson School of Management as well. And he focuses, his research is focused on the economic implications of policies, innovation, and industry-led initiatives in food and beverage markets. So he does a lot of work across a lot of sort of adjacent areas related to food waste. And today he's going to speak with us specifically about date labels, food waste, and the implications along the supply chain. So without further ado, I will let Brad take it away.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. You can hear me fine and see my screen?
Looks good. Sorry, Brad. Yep.
Okay. Thank you. So thanks to Aaron and Martin and all the other organizers for including me in today's panel. And like Aaron said, I'm going to continue this shift along the supply chain, shifting further downstream, closer to questions about consumers and trying to get inside consumers' heads and how they think about food waste and think about some tools. One tool in particular is the date labels. I've done a lot of research thinking about how consumers respond to date labels, the text that appears on packaged goods. So I'm going to get right into it here with my research objective. And I think I would say I actually have two research objectives here. The first, I feel that in the economists that conduct research in this space, thinking about food waste, I feel that there's room for more work to be done to think about building a framework that really, and this is building on some of the things that Harry DeGorder mentioned the first talk in this panel, thinking about a framework and thinking about trying to model, how some action along the supply chain will ripple through the supply chain, and we can understand not only will some tool or policy or initiative by food manufacturers, will it change food waste, but then how will it influence the prices that farmers receive, the prices that you and I pay in the food retail setting. And ultimately, I'd like to say something about how this affects prices, the foods that we purchase, and then ultimately how it affects the food that we consume and the bundles of nutrients that we consume. I'll show you a figure in a minute that maybe tries to conceptualize this better. And my second objective is to, pull in my previous work on date labels into this framework and use potential changes in date labels as a driver, as a shock to a supply chain to understand how different changes in date labels, whether it's something that's supported by food manufacturers, supported by, the government or consumer advocates, how that sort of flows through the supply chain. This is partly motivated by the observation that we do purchase a lot of added sugars and a lot of added fats. And part of me wonders, if we were to come up with some silver bullet that allowed us to reduce food waste, food loss, and we reduced food, how would it disproportionately affect some food categories or some nutrients, macronutrients differently? I guess this goes back to Professor DeGorder's talk. One unintended consequence of reducing food waste might mean that we consume more added sugars and added fats. And so this framework that I'm developing and discussing today is one way, I think, to try to get at those types of questions. Here's a couple of pictures I borrowed from a well-cited ERS publication. This is a pie chart that shows some information that most of us know. This is the breakdown of what foods, in terms of dollars. This is not foods, but food groups. The dollars that are wasted, for vegetables and fruit and meat and dairy, added fats and oils. You see is that yellow slice. But the more pink slice is for added sugar and sweeteners. This is dollars. A lot of times you'll see these statistics. We'll talk about food waste in terms of dollars. Sometimes we'll see food waste shown in terms of tons of food. This next slide shows it shows calories that are wasted. Okay, and here it shows a slightly different breakdown than the previous pie chart. Here you see that in terms of calories, approximately half of food waste is in the form, and when you think of it in terms of calories, is in the form of added fats, added sugar. Whereas if you remember, in terms of dollars, it was a much smaller, it's probably closer to 20%, 12% of the total pie in terms of dollar value. So this sort of motivates this question about, if we do have this reduction in food waste, it might shift the dollars that are wasted, the quantities that are wasted, but I think we should also be mindful of how it could affect human health or the composition of our diet. So sometimes I like to think about what am I doing with this particular piece of research here. I think again, this is sort of a twofold contribution. First of all, it was an opportunity for us to do this was a project that's been funded by the USDA. And through that funding, we were able to do a really, I think, a significant survey with consumers, asking them questions about food waste. Some of the other speakers today have talked about some of the difficulties measuring food waste. And I concur that there are lots of unresolved issues related to measuring food waste. But we're tackling this. We don't ask consumers directly questions about food waste, but we ask them questions about their likelihood of discarding food, and in particular, likelihood of discarding food when it was one day past the stated due date on the package. Some of my colleagues have done this, but they've done it, for fluid milk, or they've done it for packaged cereal or for dairy. What we try to do here, what we're doing here is we're asking these questions about food waste or the likelihood of discarding, and we're doing it across all the major food groups. So we have this group of 15 food and beverage products that are representative of all the major food groups. And so in this sense, we feel it's a more comprehensive take, how these, in our case, how these date labels affect discard rates across a wide range of products. And we also do this, some of my colleagues have looked at particular date labels. Here, we really look at a broad spectrum of date labels. We look at the use of date labels, including use by, best by, sell by, best if used by. And then we also include some treatments where we present subjects with some smart labels or some biosensors, where there's a freshness indicator on the package that's telling us some information about the freshness of the product. And I think this is something that has been discussed, and I've seen articles in food science and technology journals that date back 10 or 12 years that have been thinking about these technologies. So we decided to include these also as treatments in our analysis. These smart labels, I haven't seen them widely used in the United States, but there are some food retailers in the UK that have used these for some specific food items. And then, our second contribution is really thinking about, how these changes in our case, in date labels affect food markets, how they might affect food prices, food purchases, and then ultimately, this bundle of nutrients that we're consuming. So I think many of us are pretty aware of this date label, these questions surrounding date labels and how much food waste we can attribute to perhaps misunderstanding of date labels. And it's, there are different groups of date. Some people will classify these as date labels that sort of get consumers to think more about food quality issues. There's other date labels that have consumers perhaps thinking more about food safety issues. I think use by is a date label that perhaps in some consumers' minds, they think more about food safety. whereas other date labels such as Best By perhaps have, they drum up ideas of food quality. But we also see better if used by, sell by. Here's an example of one of the biosensors or the freshness indicators. I believe this was used on deli products in Sainsbury or Tesco. And here's used by right on the egg. Here's, this is another example that sort of makes my head spin a bit. This is some yogurt where there is a date on the package. I think it's on the top of this yogurt, but then you'll see this language on the side of the yogurt says best if used within 1 week after Best By date printed on the package. It seems that it's causing the consumer a bit of work to fully understand these date labels. So here's the 15 food products that we include in our consumer survey. And you can see that you can see how how they flow into these 7 food categories. In our economic model, we actually have 9 food categories. We have a category food away from home. That's this category 9, and we have a category 8 for alcohol. But we don't, we don't see date labels on alcohol, and we don't see date labels on food away from home. So that's why they're separated in this column. And then the 10 treatments that we are considering here. We have a control treatment that has text, but no date label. We have a treatment that includes a date label that's best by. We have use by, sell by, best if used by. And then we have 3 treatments that use these freshness indicators plus the text for use by. Then we also replicate the biosensors, these freshness indicators, in addition to the text best if used by. So we have the 4 standalone treatments, and then we have 6 of these treatments that combined language with a biosensor. I think it's also important just to highlight how date labels are actually used in the marketplace today. And we have some colleagues at the Ohio State University that have done quite a bit of surveys in supermarkets trying to tally the use of these different date labels. And this is some results from one of their studies showing that 13% of food products in grocery stores and food retailers don't include a date label. Often they include a date, but there's not a code date, but not a date label. So date label, I use date label to describe text, like the best by, use by, but often these do include a date code, which is March 16th, 2022. 31% use the language best if used by, 20% use the language best by, 5% use the language use by, 10% use the language sell by. And then there's a lot of other, types of language, including freshest by or fresh by, that this type of language is also used, but it never appears more than 3% for 3% of food products. So this sort of highlights, the spectrum of date labels that are in use in the marketplace. In addition to this, many of you are probably aware that there has been various proposals, legislative proposals, usually called the Food Date Labeling Act. And it's usually the same group of folks from the House of Representatives. And there's been some senators that have been, there's a Senate version of these bills and a House version of these bills. It's often a bipartisan proposal, trying to think about making this language more clear to consumers. And here's, I think, the most recent. Here's something I copied from Twitter. This is the most recent version of this legislative proposal introduced on December 7th, 2021. Here you can see the representatives and the senator that have been involved in these bills over time. Largely, what they want to move towards is a system where there's just 2 types of date labels. There's some sort of, I think often the idea is to have one of these date labels use the phrase used by for certain types of food products, and then all other food products use the date label best if used by. And so I'll be able to comment on this legislative proposal as well as part of this, because both of those date labels are included as treatments in our experiment. So for instance, when a subject is involved in our survey, this, I'm giving you an example of what they would see, the types of questions they would ask. And so if it was the control treatment as part of our survey, they would be given a date on this particular food product, in this case, 32 ounces of orange juice. And we would ask them the question, how likely are you to discard this product? And they're given this choice from extremely unlikely to extremely likely. Okay, so this would be the example for a subject that was in our survey when they were faced with this control or this no date label treatment. But you could see that person or someone else could be involved in our survey, and they would be given the same 32 ounces of orange juice, but here they would be given, the date would remain the same, but they would be given language, in this case, best if used by that particular date. And in this particular treatment, we also gave them information from this biosensor. So here, this particular person asked them the same question for the same orange juice, but here we're telling them more information. We're telling them it's best if used by this particular date. And in addition, they can see that this freshness indicator, the big dot can either be green, blue, or purple. And in this case, it's green. So it's signifying to this consumer, this subject in our survey, that this item still is fresh according to the biosensor. Okay, so here is an overview of how people responded to these different treatments. You can see the treatments listed from control, used by with the green, blue, and purple dots, the best if used by, again, with the green, blue, and purple freshness dots, used by, best if used by, best by, sell by. And if I can draw your attention to sort of these two columns, these are the two columns. One is somewhat likely to discard, and the other one is extremely likely to discard. So these are the two columns that are telling us something about their likelihood to have some food waste. And in the analysis, we often sum these two columns, or the answers to these two questions, and use this to think about that group of people that's likely to waste food under these different scenarios. And you can see that the sum of those two columns, in the case of the control, the sum of those two columns is close to 26% of the respondents said they're somewhat or extremely likely to discard. And this is an average across all 15 products. But you can also see as you go down, I'm not sure if we go down to the second row, the used by plus this green freshness indicator, you can see that there, the sum of somewhat likely to discard and extremely likely to discard is closer to 16%. And so there are some non-trivial differences in the likelihood to discard as we go down this column. So here's another flow chart, sort of building on the flow chart that Professor DeGorder showed us. Here we're thinking about, if we were able to change these date labels, if consumers responded and changed their food waste patterns as a result of these date labels, how would that affect the market for retail food products? How would that affect prices and quantities? Presumably, if we waste less food, then some of us are going to buy less food. And if you buy less food, that's going to have consequences to the quantities we purchase, and it will have an effect on the prices for those products. And then the change in quantity will also have an effect on, what we purchase and what we consume. I probably won't have time to talk about this today, but we can also think about how this flows back to the farm sector and how it'll affect prices and quantities for farm products that are used as ingredients to make the retail food products that you and I purchase in the store. So what I'm going to show you, I was thinking about this presentation today, and I was thinking about the audience. And so I'm just going to say that the data that we have and the analysis that we're doing, we can simulate different scenarios. So the starting point and the end point, I can adjust those, and I could show you lots of different results depending on what you think is a realistic starting point and what you think is a realistic end point. And I knew, and I saw the emails from yesterday, that there was quite a bit of excitement about technology use as a possible solution to food waste. And so I decided to show this scenario. I'm going to show you what happens, using the data from our survey. What happens if we shift from a world where largely consumers aren't paying attention to date labels, or the date labels only have a date code, they just simply have a date with no text. And then we switch to a world where food products have these biosensors and they have the best if used by information on the food products. Okay. What we're going to find is that this is going to lead to consumers paying more attention to date labels. And they are going to, especially in the case of the use of these biosensors, if the products remain fresh and still exhibit a green biosensor one day after the best if used by date, there's going to be less food waste, and there's going to be less purchases of more food at grocery stores. And this is going to have impacts on the food prices, the food quantities, and these nutrients that we ultimately purchase. And here you can see that this is a chart that shows both calorie and nutrient changes as a result of this shock. You can see that these are nutrient changes per person per year. So you can see that with this particular shock, consumers will purchase about 13,000 fewer calories per person per year as a result of this shock. If they go from an environment where they're not paying attention to food date labels, and they're shifting to this environment where we have freshness indicators and that are coupled with the best if used by date labels. And then you can see, as you go through the different food categories shown as columns and the different micro and macronutrients showed as rows, you can see where, in all cases, we're purchasing less of these micro and macronutrients, but in some cases you'll see we're we're purchasing significantly fewer of these micro and macronutrients. I think I'm running out of time, Aaron, so I'm just going to summarize here by saying a few things, just reiterating what I've been showing you. We find strong results that date label wording, the presentation of date labels, it matters. And the use of these biosensors seems to be a really important driver of consumer behavior. This partly could be because US consumers aren't used to biosensors, and this really was brought to their attention in our survey. And so this probably overestimates the importance or the impact that these biosensors could have. And I also will say that these effects differ between different food categories. I showed that if we were able to improve the communication or the line of messaging that's exhibited on these date labels, we would see less food waste, and we'd see less purchases of all nutrients, but we would see this disproportionately evident in the areas of protein, cholesterol, certain types of fat. So I don't have time to get into this today, but we also have some other results that show other scenarios where we're shifting from a world where food products have the best by date label, and we're able to show what happens if we shift date labels, to this, for instance, this date label that's been part of the proposals, the legislative proposals in the United States, best if used by. And I think I can say we've done enough analysis to be able to say with some confidence that it's not clear that shifting from best by to best if used by would actually decrease food waste for most food categories. In fact, we find many cases where that switch would increase food waste, and it would therefore lead to an increase in nutrient purchases. I also have a couple of working papers. This is one that summarizes some of the things that I've been talking about today. It's available on the Dyson website at Cornell. And I think I'll stop there. I just wanted to acknowledge the funding from the USDA. If I don't have a chance to answer your questions, or if other questions come up, 2 days from now, which often happens to me, here's my contact details.